First story, by John Reynolds. It was a chilly, moonless night in the quiet town of Stillwater, Ohio. The only source of light was the occasional flickering street lamp casting eerie shadows on the deserted streets. I was on my way home after a long shift at the local diner. My pace was brisk, and I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in my gut. As I approached an alley that led to a shortcut, I heard it, a faint, haunting melody that seemed to be carried by the wind. I paused, trying to locate the source of the sound, and that's when I saw him. A man stood at the end of the alley, his back turned to me. He was dressed in ragged clothes, and his disheveled hair hung like a curtain obscuring his face. He clutched a battered violin, and his bony fingers moved over the strings with an unnatural grace. The tune he played was haunting, like a lament from another world. I should have turned and walked away, but something held me in place, as if I were under a spell. I took a hesitant step closer, my heart pounding in my chest. As I approached, I could see his face, or what was left of it. His skin was sallow and gaunt, his eyes hollow and lifeless. The music continued, but his gaze remained fixed on some distant, invisible horizon. I tried to speak, to ask him if he needed help or if he was lost, but my words caught in my throat. It was as if the very air had thickened around us, suffocating my voice. The man suddenly stopped playing, and the silence that followed was deafening. He turned his head slowly, and his empty eyes locked onto mine. The chill that ran down my spine was like a surge of icy water. Without a word, the man extended a long, bony finger and pointed down the alley. I followed his gaze and saw a shadowy figure lurking in the darkness. My heart raced as I realized I was not alone in this sinister encounter. The other person stepped into the dim light, and I saw a glint of steel. It was a knife, its blade catching the pale light of the moon. My instincts kicked in, and I turned and ran, the sound of footsteps pursuing me echoing through the alley. As I reached the main street, I glanced back and saw the strange violinist and his companion vanishing into the night. I never found out what their intentions were, and I didn't want to. I just knew I had encountered something deeply sinister that night, something that defied explanation. Second story, by Elena Rodriguez. I had always been an avid hiker, and the rugged trails of the Pacific Northwest had become my second home. It was a moonlit night when I decided to venture into the dense woods surrounding Portland, Oregon, for a solo hike. The crunch of leaves underfoot and the whispering of the wind through the trees were my only companions. As I navigated deeper into the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was a primal sensation, one that had kept our ancestors alive in the wild for centuries. I adjusted my headlamp, scanning the darkness for any signs of life. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl that sent a shiver down my spine. My heart raced, and I knew I had to find the source of the sound. As I ventured further into the forest, the growling became more pronounced, closer, and I realized it was not the cry of a wild animal. I came upon a small clearing, bathed in the silvery light of the moon. In the center, a figure stood hunched over, their back turned to me. They were wearing tattered clothes, and their long, matted hair hung like a curtain obscuring their face. The growling continued, emanating from the figure. It was a sound unlike anything I had ever heard, a sinister, inhuman sound that made my blood run cold. I should have turned and run, but a morbid curiosity held me in place. As I watched, the figure's body seemed to contort, as if it were transforming before my eyes. Their limbs elongated, their fingers becoming gnarled and claw-like. The growling grew louder, more animalistic, and I realized I was no longer in the presence of a human being. Fear surged through me, and I stumbled back, snapping a twig underfoot. The figure turned its head slowly, and my headlamp revealed a grotesque, distorted face. Its eyes were yellow and predatory, and its mouth curled into a malevolent grin. Without hesitation, I turned and fled, the thing in the clearing following me. I could hear it crashing through the underbrush, its growls echoing in the night. Panic set in, and I pushed myself harder, my heart pounding in my chest. I burst out of the forest and into the safety of the moonlit trailhead. I never looked back, but I could still hear the growls fading into the distance. I knew I had encountered something otherworldly that night, something that defied the laws of nature. Third story, by James Williams. I had recently moved to the bustling city of London, and the excitement of urban life was a stark contrast to my quiet upbringing in the countryside. My new apartment was in the heart of the city, and while I relished the energy of London, it was a restless place, one where the night held its own set of secrets. One rainy evening, as I strolled through the dimly lit streets of Soho, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. It was a sensation of unseen eyes on my back, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I quickened my pace, trying to lose the invisible pursuer. I turned onto a narrow, winding alley that I hoped would provide an escape route. The cobbled stones were slick with rain, and the hushed ambience of the alley only intensified my unease. I felt like a character in a gritty detective novel, with danger lurking around every corner. As I ventured further into the alley, I heard the soft, deliberate footsteps of someone following me. My heart pounded, and I knew I had to confront my pursuer. I spun around, my eyes scanning the darkness, and that's when I saw him. A man stood at the end of the alley, his silhouette shrouded in the murky shadows. He wore a long, tattered coat that flapped in the wind, and his face was hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He had an air of malevolence about him, and I knew I was in the presence of a stranger whose intentions were far from benign. I asked him what he wanted, my voice wavering with a mixture of fear and anger. He didn't respond, but his gloved hand reached beneath his coat and pulled out a gleaming knife. It caught the faint light of a distant lamppost, and the blade seemed to gleam with a sinister allure. With a deliberate step, the man advanced, the knife held with an expert grip. I knew I had to act, and I turned and fled down the alley, the sound of his footsteps close behind. The rain-soaked streets seemed to conspire against me, making every step treacherous as I raced to escape my relentless pursuer. The man's cold laughter echoed through the narrow alley, and it sent a chill down my spine. I darted around a corner, desperately searching for help in the deserted streets. My heart hammered in my chest as I ran, my mind racing with thoughts of survival. Just when it felt like all hope was lost, I stumbled upon a bustling street filled with late-night revelers. The neon lights and lively chatter provided a stark contrast to the menacing presence that had pursued me. Gasping for breath, I tried to blend in with the crowd, my eyes darting around, searching for any sign of my pursuer. But he was gone, as if he had melted back into the shadows from whence he came. I knew I had encountered a dangerous stranger that night, a faceless menace whose motives were as inscrutable as the night itself. The city, which had once seemed so full of life and excitement, now held a new, chilling dimension in my mind. Fourth Story, by Sophie Roberts. I had always been an avid camper, and the rugged wilderness of the Rocky Mountains had become my sanctuary. My latest excursion took me deep into the forests of Colorado, where I sought solitude and a connection with nature. Little did I know that the wilderness held a different kind of connection, one that would forever haunt my memories. It was a moonless night when I set up my campsite deep in the heart of the forest. The only illumination came from the stars, which glittered like diamonds in the ink-black sky. The chirping of crickets and the distant howling of wolves were my only companions. As I sat by the crackling campfire, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and I scanned the surrounding darkness for any signs of life. That's when I heard it, the distant sound of a woman crying. It was a haunting, mournful sound that sent shivers down my spine. I couldn't ignore it, and I grabbed my flashlight, determined to find the source of the distress. I followed the cries through the dense forest, my heart pounding in my chest. The eerie ambience of the night seemed to intensify, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The cries led me to a small clearing, bathed in the pale light of the stars. There I saw her, a woman dressed in tattered, blood-stained clothing, her face obscured by long, disheveled hair. She knelt by a makeshift grave, her sobs echoing through the night. My instincts told me to turn and run, to get as far away from this strange encounter as possible. But something held me in place, a mix of sympathy and morbid curiosity. I called out to her, asking if she needed help. She turned slowly, her face emerging from the shadow of her hair, and what I saw left me paralyzed with fear. Her eyes were empty, devoid of any trace of humanity. Her skin was pallid and mottled, as if she had risen from the grave herself. In her blood-streaked hand, she held a rusted, wicked-looking knife. With a sinister smile, she approached me, her footsteps echoing in the silence of the forest. I turned and fled, my heart racing, the nightmarish cries of the woman following me through the trees. I burst back into my campsite, grabbed my belongings, and made a frantic escape, the chilling encounter forever etched in my mind. The wilderness, once a place of solace and connection, had revealed a sinister presence that defied all logic and explanation. Fifth Story, by Mark Thompson. My job required me to work late hours in a bustling metropolis, and on one particularly stormy night in New York City, I found myself walking through the deserted streets, the rain pouring down in torrents. My footsteps echoed eerily, and the city seemed to have transformed into an alien landscape. As I trudged through the dimly lit alleyways, I was acutely aware of my isolation. The distant rumble of thunder added to the ominous ambience, and the wind howled through the empty streets. The only source of illumination came from the flickering neon signs and the sporadic flashes of lightning. I was on the verge of reaching my apartment when I saw him, a man standing at the end of a dark, narrow alley. He was drenched in rain, his clothes clinging to his emaciated frame. His face was obscured by a hood, and his eyes were hidden in the shadow. The man seemed to appear out of thin air, as if the night itself had given birth to him. I quickened my pace, not wanting to engage with a stranger in this desolate, eerie night. But as I passed by the alley, I heard his voice, a raspy, almost whisper-like sound that cut through the rain. He called out to me, asking for help. I hesitated but couldn't ignore the plea in his voice. I turned and approached him cautiously. He extended a trembling hand toward me, and I saw that it was covered in fresh blood. panic coursed through me as I realized that something was terribly wrong. I asked him what had happened, my voice quivering. With great effort, the man managed to mumble a few incoherent words about an accident. I could barely make out his story, but the urgency in his eyes told me that he needed assistance. I fumbled in my pockets for my phone, intending to call for help, but before I could do anything, the man's demeanor changed. He dropped his arm, and the hood of his soaked jacket slipped back, revealing his face. What I saw was a grotesque horror, a face contorted with a manic, malevolent grin. His eyes were wide, filled with a darkness that sent a jolt of terror through my veins. He moved toward me with an unnerving speed, his fingers twisting into long, twisted claws. I turned and ran, the sound of his maniacal laughter echoing in the alley. The relentless downpour seemed to conspire against me, making the slick streets treacherous as I fled. I reached my apartment, soaked to the bone, and locked the door behind me. I never found out what the man's intentions were that night, and I didn't want to. The city, once a place of vibrant energy, had revealed a terrifying underbelly that I had never imagined. Sixth Story, by Isabella Garcia. I had recently moved to the city of Madrid, Spain, and my love for late-night strolls had become a way to explore the vibrant culture of this historical city. One night, I found myself wandering the winding streets of the old town, with centuries-old buildings looming over me and casting eerie, elongated shadows in the moonlight. The cobbled streets were deserted, and the only sound was the distant echo of laughter and music from a nearby tapas bar. I couldn't help but be enchanted by the sense of history that surrounded me. As I walked along, I suddenly became aware of footsteps behind me. I turned and saw a figure approaching, a woman dressed in traditional Spanish attire. She was covered in a black lace mantilla, and her face was veiled, her eyes hidden from view. She walked with a strange, almost ethereal grace, her footsteps barely making a sound. I couldn't tell if she was following me or if our paths had simply crossed, but the encounter left me with a sense of unease. I continued on my way, convinced that it was just a chance encounter. But as I turned into a narrow alley, I realized that the woman was following me. I quickened my pace, hoping to lose her in the labyrinthine streets. The echo of her footsteps grew louder, and I knew she was gaining on me. I glanced back, and that's when I saw her face, pale, almost translucent. Her eyes were black and lifeless. Her gaze held an unsettling intensity, and I felt a surge of fear. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. The labyrinthine streets seemed to twist and turn, attempting to trap me as I raced to escape my mysterious pursuer. The old buildings loomed over me like silent witnesses to my flight. I finally reached a bustling square, where the laughter and chatter of people enjoying their evening filled the air. I turned and saw that the woman had disappeared into the shadows. I never found out who she was or what her intentions were, but the encounter left me with a lingering sense of dread. The city, once a place of history and culture, had revealed a sinister presence that I couldn't explain. Seventh Story, by Daniel Miller. I had always found solace in the rolling hills and picturesque landscapes of the Cotswolds in England. As an avid hiker, I cherished my evening walks through the serene countryside. But one fateful night, I discovered that even the most tranquil settings can hold a dark and enigmatic secret. It was a moonless night, and the mist hung low, shrouding the hills in an eerie, ghostly atmosphere. I was taking my usual route through the winding trails, my footsteps echoing in the silence of the night. As I ventured deeper into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The dense fog seemed to thicken, creating an almost impenetrable wall around me. My senses were on high alert, every rustle and whisper in the woods sending a shiver down my spine. That's when I heard it, the faint sound of humming. It was a haunting, off-key melody that seemed to seep through the trees. I paused, my breath catching in my throat, trying to pinpoint the source. As I moved deeper into the woods, the humming grew louder and more distinct. It was coming from a clearing bathed in an otherworldly, silvery light. In the center, a figure stood, their back turned to me. The figure was a woman, her long, unkempt hair hanging like a curtain, obscuring her face. She swayed to her haunting tune, her tattered dress flowing in the breeze. I should have turned and fled, but something inexplicable held me in place, a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. I called out to her, asking if she needed help, but my words seemed to get lost in the fog. The woman continued her eerie humming, seemingly oblivious to my presence. As I approached, I noticed something even more chilling. The woman was standing in front of a circle of stones, and within the circle, candles were arranged, their flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the ground. The temperature dropped noticeably, and a chill ran down my spine. I watched in horror as the woman began to sway with greater intensity, her melody growing more discordant. It was as if she were in the thrall of some dark, otherworldly force. Suddenly, the woman turned her head to face me, and what I saw left me paralyzed with fear. Her eyes were devoid of any humanity, dark voids that seemed to pierce into my soul. Her lips curled into a sinister grin. With a sudden, menacing step, she approached me. Panic seized me, and I turned and ran, the sound of her maniacal laughter echoing in the mist-shrouded woods. I made my way back to civilization, my heart pounding, the haunting encounter forever etched in my mind. The tranquil countryside, once a sanctuary of peace, had revealed a malevolent secret that I couldn't fathom. 8th Story, by Lisa Davis. Living in the heart of Paris was a dream come true. The City of Lights held endless opportunities for exploration, but on one particular night, it also held a chilling encounter that I could never have anticipated. I was taking a leisurely walk along the Seine River, enjoying the cool breeze and the reflection of the city's lights on the water. The famous landmarks of Paris stood as majestic sentinels in the night. As I walked, I noticed a solitary figure in the distance. A man was standing on one of the bridges that crossed the river, his silhouette shrouded by the dim streetlights. He appeared to be gazing out at the water, lost in thought. Something about the scene struck me as odd. The hour was late, and the bridges were usually empty at this time of night. But I dismissed my unease and continued my walk. As I drew nearer, I realized the man was not just staring at the river but was muttering to himself, a low, incessant stream of words that seemed to have no coherence. The hair on my neck stood on end, and I hesitated, unsure of whether to continue or turn back. Just then, he turned his head, and the dim light revealed his face, a visage contorted by madness. His eyes were wide and unblinking, and his lips moved with a manic intensity. He was clearly unhinged, and I took a step back. As I retreated, he began to scream, his voice echoing through the empty streets. The sound was a chilling, guttural cry, one that sent a shock of fear through me. I quickened my pace, not wanting to be any closer to this deranged stranger. The man's screams grew louder, more frenzied, and I knew I had to escape this unsettling encounter. I turned and ran, the echoes of his madness following me through the Parisian streets. I never found out who he was or what had driven him to such a state, and I didn't want to. The city, once a symbol of beauty and culture, had revealed a dark and inexplicable presence that left me deeply unnerved. Ninth Story, by Oliver Richardson. I had always been fascinated by the paranormal and the unexplained, so when I heard about a reputedly haunted asylum on the outskirts of Charleston, South Carolina, I couldn't resist the opportunity to explore. Little did I know that my curiosity would lead me to a spine-tingling encounter. It was a warm summer night when I arrived at the old, decaying building, the full moon casting an eerie glow on its weathered facade. Vines snaked up the cracked walls, and the windows were broken or boarded up, giving the place a foreboding appearance. As I ventured deeper into the asylum, the silence of the night was broken only by the chirping of crickets and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. I could feel a sense of heaviness in the air, as if the building itself was burdened with the weight of its history. I reached a long, dimly lit corridor, the floor creaking beneath my every step. The only source of light was my flashlight, its beam cutting through the inky blackness. The corridor seemed to stretch on endlessly, and I had to remind myself that I was alone, that there was no reason to be afraid. That's when I heard it, a faint, distant whisper. It was a sound like no other, filled with sorrow and longing. I froze, straining to hear more clearly, but the whispers were elusive, like faint echoes from another world. As I continued down the corridor, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. I could make out words, fragmented sentences that seemed to tell a story of pain and despair. The voices were coming from behind a heavy, wooden door. I approached the door with trepidation, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I pushed it open, and what I saw made my blood run cold. In the dim light, I could make out the outlines of people, silhouettes of former patients, perhaps, standing in a circle. They were swaying back and forth, their hands reaching out to touch something that I couldn't see. The whispers seemed to emanate from them, as if their very souls were trapped in a haunting limbo. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the scene, the overwhelming sense of sorrow and suffering pressing down on me. As I watched, the figures turned toward me, their hollow eyes locking onto mine. The atmosphere in the room grew heavy, as if the air itself had thickened. Panic surged through me, and I turned and fled, the chilling whispers following me down the corridor. I never found out the true nature of the apparitions I encountered that night, and I didn't want to. The old asylum, once a place of confinement and suffering, had revealed the haunting secret that defied explanation. 10th Story, by Mia Johnson. New Orleans, Louisiana, was known for its vibrant culture and lively nightlife, but it was also a city that held its fair share of mysteries. One sultry night, I ventured into the heart of the French Quarter, where the ancient buildings whispered secrets from centuries past. The cobblestone streets were alive with the rhythm of jazz music, and the colorful facades of the historic buildings seemed to come to life in the glow of street lamps. I was captivated by the atmosphere and the intoxicating scent of Creole cuisine wafting through the air. As I explored the winding alleys and hidden courtyards, I found myself in an ancient square, surrounded by historic buildings that seemed to lean in conspiratorially. The gas lamps cast flickering shadows, and the night seemed to hold a sense of magic. That's when I saw him, a man sitting on a stoop, his back hunched, and his hat pulled low. He appeared to be playing a saxophone, the smooth, sultry notes, filling the night with their haunting melody. I approached the musician, captivated by his skill and the soulful music he created. He was dressed in a tattered, vintage suit, and his fingers moved over the sax with an uncanny grace. The atmosphere in the square seemed to shift, as if we were in the presence of something otherworldly. As I listened, I realized that the tune he played was not just any melody. It was a song that had a chilling reputation in the city, a tune that some believed had the power to summon spirits from beyond the grave. Despite the warnings and my growing unease, I couldn't tear myself away from the music. The haunting notes seemed to ensnare my very soul, and I watched as the musician's face contorted with an intensity that was almost otherworldly. Suddenly, the night grew eerily silent, and the square darkened as if a thick fog had descended. I felt a chill crawl down my spine as I realized that the square was no longer empty. Figures, shadowy and indistinct, appeared around us. They moved with a graceful, spectral quality, their eyes empty and mournful. It was as if the music had called them from the depths of the past. The musician's song continued, and the apparitions began to dance, their movements both haunting and beautiful. I couldn't tear my eyes away, even as a sense of dread crept over me. As the song reached its climax, the figures turned toward me, their eyes locking onto mine. The atmosphere was charged with an otherworldly presence, and I could feel their silent, pleading voices in my mind. Panic surged through me, and I turned and fled, the echoes of the haunting melody following me through the dark, narrow streets of the French Quarter. I never found out the true nature of the spirits I encountered that night, and I didn't want to. The city, once a place of vibrant culture, had revealed a supernatural secret that defied rational explanation. Thank you for sticking with us through the whole video. Also, I recommend you this video you see on screen, one of the scariest on my channel. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe and like this video. This helps me bring you more thrilling content every day. If this video sent shivers down your spine, let me know in the comments.